Hello, this is Timmy Black, and welcome once again to another episode of The Lives of Contemporary Artists. Now, today, I'd like to talk about an artist that I've been following for years. Her name, and I'm sure my fans out there are already very familiar with her. Her name is Petal Tenafly Jones, P.T. Jones. P.T. to her friends. Now Petal, or P.T., is the kind of artist who is thoughtful, trendy, sensitive, quirky, and extremely strategic in her career. She studied in the finest, well, if not the finest, at least the most prestigious institutions, having earned her bachelor's degree in critical feminist theory at Cal Arts and her master's at the Royal College of Art in London, where she concentrated on fiber design technology and documentary photography. Now, we met the other day at her Jefferson Boulevard studio in Los Angeles to discuss Petal Tenafly Jones, to discuss P.T. Jones. I'm not exactly sure if that was my intent when I initially reached out to her. I was more interested in how she felt about her, shall we say, the uneven critical response to her latest exhibition at the Hammer. That's what I wanted to talk about. The show she was in fact she was prominently featured in, was a thematic group hodgepodge called Obsession's Second Century. It was curated by the brilliant and gregarious feminist scholar Victoria Surge, and the show was basically a free-for-all, a tohu and bohu of gray and dark brown objects clustered on the floor with lots of rope and lots of video projections. I actually thought that the show was great, was really great, especially Petal's work, which was maybe a little less gray and maybe a little less brown, but with a lot more rope and a few pieces of pressed aluminum thrown in for good measure. Anyway, the idea behind the piece, and I asked her about this, frankly, because I wasn't sure about it when I saw the show, was, well, she explained to me, the idea of the piece was how the degradation of the planet, was affecting specific regions of the world more severely than others, and how this disparity was a direct consequence of colonialism. And she calls it climate colonialism. And her position is that the Western industrial economic model is what she memorably calls a juggernaut of injustice. It's a great term. It's a great phrase. It's really catchy. A juggernaut of injustice. It's very good. It's very, very good. Juggernaut of injustice. Anyway, we had this terrific conversation, and I learned a lot. But it got me thinking about a phrase that I don't know. It always seemed in the olden days was an article of faith when it came to art and artists, but has been recently relegated to the fringes of art therapy and art pedagogy. The term I'm thinking of, this old-fashioned, politically questionable term I'm thinking of, is self-expression. You don't really hear about self-expression too much these days, and frankly, I'm a little embarrassed even to as it rolls off my tongue, I'm frankly embarrassed. Let me say it a few times. Let me say it a few times so I get used to it. Self-expression. 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 There. I got it. Self-expression. Anyway, I was wondering, looking back on the past 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 100 years, when the unambiguous purpose of art was, advocacy. It was advocacy. I mean, when you think about all the Buddhas and all the Shivas and all the Jesuses out there, when you think about all the scary art from the Counter-Reformation, the dark, menacing descents from the cross, the epiphanies, the flights into Egypt, the Annunciations. I mean, there's a lot of desperate, passionate propaganda out there. It seems like if you lived in a Catholic country, the only way to get ahead as an artist was to churn out these predictable, biblical billboards. Now, of course, there are a few artists that stand out. There are a few, very few, but there are a few who are able to sneak in a bit of their own individual temperaments into their work. Obviously, Caravaggio comes to mind, but for the most part, the stuff you see in churches and cathedrals in Italy and Spain and France are examples of reasonably well-executed political and religious coercion. And while I'm talking to P.T. Jones in her studio and listening to her genuinely heartfelt convictions about the juggernaut of injustice, I began ruminating on the historical moment when art moved away from political and religious coercion to an expression of individual and original invention. And now, we're all familiar with how the story all changed in the 19th century, where artists excluded from the traditional sources of patronage developed a vernacular that was more personal, more experimental, and whose subject matter was more frivolous, lighter, dumber even. Eventually, it became less of what the artist said and more on how things were expressed. By the time the 20th century rolled around, the artist as sovereign was not only a commonplace, but was an absolute imperative. No more tiresome advocacy. It was time to celebrate the quirky, eccentric, unpredictable self. And as I looked around Petal Tenafly Jones's well-appointed studio, I was struck by how little of her I found there. I mean, aside from the Minecraft fluffies and a few family photos on the fridge, the place had a very corporate feel. As I watched her two studio assistants glued to their laptops, I immediately thought of the workshops of the Renaissance and Baroque masters with their busy apprentices grinding pigment and mixing plaster. Yes, there was a short spasm of self-expression in the long history of art. But that was an aberration. Art essentially is a business, and like any business, the customer is always right. Now, the primary objective of our current crop of artists is an advocacy that is just as strident, just as tendentious as the agenda of the Inquisition. So, the next time you find yourself in a gallery or museum and you're surrounded by gray and brown objects on the floor with lots of rope and a surround sound of projections and wall labels that can compete in their circuitous complexity with Heidegger's Being and Time or the Book of Leviticus. Try to remind yourself that modernism was just a short-lived honeymoon. We're back again to the norm. We're back to the norm that defines the history of art, which is to say, we are back to the conservative values of the dominant culture, the self-congratulations, the affirmations that we're all on the same side of the barricades. So the next time you see an exhibition focusing on gender, on identity, remember that over the past dozen or so centuries, as far as tiresome and heavy-handed activism is concerned, not much has changed in the lives of contemporary artists.